A simple staircase could decide the fate of a medieval castle. These steps were not just for climbing. They were sophisticated psychological traps, meticulously engineered to control and terrify any invader. By the end of this journey, you will see every ancient fortress as a masterwork of mental manipulation. We will explore why a spiral always turned one specific way, how an uneven step could break an army's momentum, and what the chilling purpose of a murder hole truly was. This exploration reveals that our ancestors were not just master builders, but also brilliant early psychologists. What does the design of your own surroundings say about the mind of its creator? That battlefield was a maze of calculated terror. Think of a castle not as a single, solid wall, but as a series of layered defenses, each one designed to psychologically wear down an attacker. The journey from the outer gate to the inner keep was a slow, stressful procession through a world built to make you feel lost and exposed. Wide courtyards would suddenly narrow into tight corridors. Open spaces were overshadowed by towering walls, leaving you with no cover from the arrows and stones hurled from above. This was not random. It was a deliberate strategy of psychological attrition. The very layout of the fortress was a weapon. Every turn was a potential ambush point. Every shadow could hide an archer. The architect's goal was to create a constant state of anxiety, to grind away at the invaders' confidence until their courage broke. This is why the staircase was so much more than a connection between floors. It was the ultimate expression of this defensive philosophy. It took a group of armed men and forced them into a single, vulnerable file. It robbed them of their numerical strength and their ability to fight as a unit. To understand why a spiral turns clockwise or a step is made uneven, you must first see the staircase as the castle's final, most intimate kill zone. That central stone column was more than a structural support. It was a silent opponent, strategically placed to fight alongside the castle's defenders. For a right-handed knight climbing a clockwise spiral, every step was a struggle. His sword arm, his dominant side, was perpetually pinned against the curving inner wall. He could not draw his arm back for a proper swing. A powerful overhead strike was impossible, reduced to an awkward, cramped thrust. His shield was equally useless, often getting caught on the stonework, leaving his entire body exposed. Now picture the defender above. He is not just holding the high ground. He possesses the entire outer curve of the staircase. With his own right arm completely free, he can swing his weapon in wide, devastating arcs. He can thrust downward with immense force. The geometry of the space itself makes him faster, stronger, and far more deadly than the man struggling below. Historical records from sieges are filled with accounts of seasoned warriors being defeated not by a more skilled opponent, but by a wall. They speak of the sheer frustration of being unable to use their weapons, of feeling the cold stone constantly pressing against their elbow, turning their greatest strength into a fatal liability. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a deliberate, calculated nullification of an attacker's primary advantage. The staircase transformed a group of armored knights into a slow, single file of vulnerable individuals, each one waiting for their turn to be picked off by a defender who enjoyed every possible benefit. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare, where the environment is engineered to give one side an overwhelming edge. The builders of these castles understood human anatomy with the precision of a modern engineer. They knew that most people are right-handed, and they designed a trap that specifically targeted this commonality. It was a personalized form of defense, tailored to the body of the individual soldier, making the very act of climbing an exercise in psychological and physical defeat. But the psychological warfare did not stop with the spiral's turn. The very surface you walked on was a trap. Picture an invading soldier, having survived the deadly spiral, now charging up a final flight of steps toward the defenders. His muscles are primed for a rhythmic sprint, his mind focused on the enemy above. Yet with every step, his footing betrays him. One step is shallow, the next unexpectedly tall. The depth of each tread varies without warning. This was not poor construction. It was a deliberate design known as staggered steps, a masterstroke of psychological disruption. In the chaos of a fight, your body relies on muscle memory and predictable patterns to move efficiently. These uneven steps shattered that rhythm entirely. An attacker could not build momentum. Each stride required a conscious calculation, forcing his eyes down to his feet and breaking his focus on the threats ahead. This constant, low-level cognitive load in a high-stress situation was mentally exhausting. It turned a simple ascent into a clumsy, faltering ordeal, making the entire invading force slower and more predictable. For the castle's defenders, however, these irregular steps were second nature. They had trained on them, lived with them, and could navigate the staircase with unconscious ease. This granted them a fluidity of movement that their stumbling opponents completely lacked. Modern environmental psychology confirms what medieval builders understood intuitively. Unpredictable environments significantly increase anxiety and drastically reduce a person's ability to perform complex tasks. The staircase was engineered to be that unpredictable environment, a pathway of controlled chaos that preyed upon the brain's deep-seated need for order. Each uncertain step was a tiny victory for the defense, a subtle erosion of confidence that turned the invaders' own bodies against them. And this narrowing was not just a matter of width. It was a deliberate act of compression. Medieval staircases were often so restrictive that only a single person could ascend at any given moment. This forced singularity was a psychological masterstroke. 100 soldiers at the gate became a long, vulnerable line of individuals, each one isolated and forced to face the defender alone. The overwhelming strength of a unified army was shattered, reduced to a sequence of one-on-one duels where the man at the top, with the high ground and room to maneuver, held an almost insurmountable advantage. Imagine being that second or third soldier in line. You cannot see the fight ahead, only hear the clash of steel and the cries of the man in front of you. You are pressed against cold stone, unable to retreat, unable to help. Your comrades behind you are just a pushing, anxious mass, adding to the pressure but offering no real support. This claustrophobic confinement amplified a deep-seated fear of entrapment. It was a physical representation of being funneled into a trap, a sensation that could easily trigger panic and force desperate, poor decisions. The space itself limited your tools of war. A large shield became a cumbersome obstacle, scraping against the walls. A long spear or a heavy polearm was impossible to wield effectively in such tight quarters. You were stripped of your tactical options and left with only a short sword or an axe, while the defender above could use the full range of his weapons. This restrictive design systematically dismantled unit cohesion and morale. The staircase did not just slow the enemy down, it broke apart the very idea of an army, turning a coordinated force into a collection of frightened, isolated individuals. This principle of forced singularity was a cornerstone of defensive strategy, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a sword, but a wall placed just close enough to make a soldier feel completely alone. Height itself became a weapon in the defender's arsenal. Every step an attacker took upward was a step taken in exhaustion, burning precious energy and oxygen while laden with heavy armor. They were essentially performing a strenuous workout under a constant hail of projectiles and threats. Meanwhile, the defenders waited above, their muscles fresh, their breathing steady. They did not need to climb. They simply held their position, turning their own body weight and the pull of gravity into a formidable ally. This established a brutal power dynamic long before the first sword was even crossed. The defender literally and figuratively looked down upon the invader, a physical manifestation of superiority that seeped into the mind of everyone involved. That elevated position was not just about a better angle for a sword swing. It offered a complete psychological panorama. The defender could see everything. He could watch the entire struggling line of attackers, anticipate their moves, and direct his defense with calm precision. The attacker below, however, had a view of nothing but the backs of his comrades and the cold, unforgiving stone steps ahead. His world narrowed to a tunnel of immediate danger, with no ability to plan or see the bigger picture. This symbolism of height is deeply rooted in our psychology. We instinctively associate elevation with control and authority. Think of a judge on a bench, a speaker on a stage, or a king on a throne. Medieval builders weaponized this innate perception. They designed their strongholds to ensure that in any confrontation, their men were always the ones on the throne, and the invaders were always the ones pleading from below. The staircase forced the attacker to fight not just against soldiers, but against the very concept of dominance, making the long, arduous climb feel like an insurmountable quest to dethrone a power that had every advantage. The stone itself was listening, and it was reporting everything it heard. Every footfall on those hard steps, every metallic scrape of a gauntlet against the wall, every strained command from an officer was captured and amplified by the unforgiving surfaces. This was not mere background noise, it was a deliberate acoustic weapon. For the climbing soldier, the world dissolved into a terrifying symphony of his own making. The clatter of his own armor echoed back at him, magnified and distorted. The shouts of his comrades blurred into an incomprehensible roar, making coordinated tactics impossible. His own labored breathing, amplified in the confined space, became a constant reminder of his exhaustion and fear. This sensory overload pushed the human brain beyond its limits, transforming a military formation into a disoriented and panicked mob. Meanwhile, the defenders waited in relative silence. To them, the echoing staircase was a perfect intelligence system. They could hear the exact number of men on the steps, gauge their fatigue from the heaviness of their steps, and pinpoint their position by the direction of the sounds. A single dropped sword or a sudden cry of pain told them everything they needed to know about the state of the assault below. This auditory advantage allowed for calm, precise responses in the face of chaos. The castle was not just a structure of defense. It was a living entity that spoke, using its own voice to confuse its enemies and guide its protectors. This careful engineering of the soundscape reveals a level of strategic thought that goes far beyond mere walls and weapons. Even the promise of forward movement could be a lie. Some staircases were masterpieces of misdirection, designed with architectural deceptions that preyed upon an invader's most basic assumptions. A seemingly significant landing would lead not to a grand hall or a fortified door, but to a solid, unyielding wall. A smaller, tempting staircase might branch off, promising a flanking route or a secret passage, only to spiral back down or terminate in a dead-end room. These were not design errors, they were carefully planned psychological traps known as false summits. For a soldier who had fought every step of the way, reaching what felt like a major milestone only to find his path utterly blocked was a devastating blow. The surge of adrenaline and hope would crash into a wall of pure frustration. This sudden reversal forced a terrible decision. Do they stand there, exposed and confused, trying to figure out their next move? Or do they turn around and retreat back down the treacherous steps they just climbed, now under renewed attack from defenders who knew exactly where they would be? This manipulation of expectation is a classic tactic for breaking morale. It sows discord and doubt within the ranks, turning soldiers against their leaders and their own judgment. The castle was no longer just a building to be captured. It became a living maze, a puzzle box of stone where confidence was systematically dismantled by architectural trickery. The defenders, with their intimate knowledge of the true layout, could use these deceptions to their greatest advantage. They could ambush groups as they bottlenecked at a dead end, or harass them with arrows as they tried to backtrack through the very kill zones they thought they had passed. This element of calculated misdirection reveals a chillingly sophisticated understanding of the human mind. The architects knew that to defeat an army, you did not always need to break its shields. You only needed to break its spirit, one disappointing dead end at a time. Above the climber's head, the ceiling itself could come alive with death. Built directly into the stone vaults over a staircase were the chilling openings known as murder holes. These were not random gaps in the masonry. They were intentional portals for destruction, allowing defenders to attack from a completely uncontested angle. A soldier struggling up the winding, uneven steps had to focus on the armed man waiting for him at the top, but with murder holes in play, he also had to fear the sky falling on him. Rocks and heavy stones could be dropped, cracking helmets and breaking bones. Far worse was the liquid terror of boiling water or hot sand, substances that would seep through the gaps in plate armor, inflicting horrific burns and creating instant, agonizing panic. This was a brutal form of multi-vector warfare, forcing an attacker to defend in two directions at once. His shield was useless, designed to protect his front, not his crown. To even attempt a defense against the overhead threat, he would have to stop, crane his neck upward, and expose his entire body to the defender in front of him. This created an impossible choice and a state of hyper-vigilant anxiety that could paralyze an entire assault. The mere knowledge that these holes existed was a powerful psychological weapon. Soldiers would instinctively slow their advance, their eyes constantly flicking upward, their formation breaking as they bunched up or tried to press themselves against the walls. This hesitation made them slower, more predictable, and perfect targets for the defenders above and ahead. The murder hole was the ultimate expression of total environmental control. It transformed the staircase from a challenging pathway into a gauntlet where death rained down from the very architecture, proving that in a medieval fortress there was no such thing as a safe direction. This architectural division was a language of power, spoken in stone and step. The castle housed two entirely different worlds, separated not by walls alone, but by the very staircases people used. For the lord of the castle and his esteemed guests, the journey upward was one of grace and ceremony. They ascended broad, evenly spaced steps on grand staircases that rose in gentle, straight flights. This was a path designed for dignity, allowing for flowing robes and a stately procession into the heart of power. Every aspect of this route communicated honor, welcome, and an unquestioned right to be there. In stark contrast, the soldiers, servants, and any attacker were relegated to a different reality. They were funneled into the narrow, twisting, and treacherous staircases we have been exploring. For them, every ascent was a struggle, a constant physical battle against the architecture itself. This was not just a matter of efficiency. It was a deliberate, non-verbal statement hammered into the consciousness of everyone who used it. The building itself was telling you your place. If you were climbing the defensive staircase, you were inferior, you were unwelcome, you were an obstacle to be managed. For an invading soldier, this added a profound layer of psychological oppression to the already terrifying physical ordeal. He was not merely fighting men. He was fighting a system, a social order that had been physically built into the environment to humiliate him at every turn. His cramped, exhausting climb was a constant, tactile reminder that he did not belong in this space of power and that the very stones were aligned against him. The staircase enforced a brutal social hierarchy, proving that territorial defense was also deeply intertwined with the defense of class and status. This architectural filtering system ensured that power was not only protected by walls, but performed and reinforced with every single step taken within them. The Shaytau-Dacowski did not just have strong walls, it possessed a staircase that became a legend in its own right. This was not a simple set of steps leading to the Great Hall. It was a gauntlet of psychological warfare, a masterpiece that brought every defensive principle into brutal harmony. The approach to the keep forced attackers into a clockwise spiral, immediately placing every right-handed man at a severe disadvantage, his sword arm pinned uselessly against the central column. The passage was so narrow that only one person could advance at a time, breaking the momentum of any charge into a slow, vulnerable procession. And just when an attacker thought they understood the path, the staircase would turn sharply, changing direction to disorient and confuse, eliminating any remaining rhythm or predictability. Historical analysis of the castle's records suggests this design was considered nearly impregnable. The reputation of the staircase alone was a powerful deterrent. There are accounts from the region of sieges where seasoned commanders, upon assessing the tower's entrance, deliberately chose to avoid a direct assault. They knew that sending men up that specific stairwell was less a military tactic and more a suicide mission. The legend of Dacowski's strength was not built on myth, but on the cold, hard geometry of its most famous staircase. It proved that the most powerful defense could be an idea, the psychologically crippling certainty of failure, carved directly into stone. These defensive innovations were not born overnight. They were forged in the relentless fires of siege warfare, a continuous dialogue of attack and defense that spanned centuries. The earliest Norman motte and Bailey castles relied on steep, often removable wooden stairs. These were practical, but they represented a single, brittle line of defense. An attacker could focus all their energy on this one vulnerable point, using fire or brute force to break through. As the crossbow and the trebuchet began to dominate the battlefield, castle architecture had to adapt or fall. The simple wooden tower gave way to the formidable stone keep, and with it, the staircase transformed from a simple access route into the complex psychological weapon we have been exploring. This was an architectural arms race, with each new siege providing a brutal lesson in what worked and what failed catastrophically. The spiral turn, the uneven steps, the murder holes, these were not just ideas. They were hard-won solutions to the problems of yesterday's battles, etched permanently into the blueprints of the next generation of fortresses. The pinnacle of this evolution was the Concentric castle, a masterpiece of layered defense with multiple rings of towering walls. Within these stone labyrinths, the staircase systems became equally complex. They were no longer just paths to the top. They were carefully controlled circulation routes, designed to channel enemies into pre-planned kill zones while allowing defenders to move swiftly between battlements. This required a new level of strategic foresight, where the flow of human movement was as important as the strength of the masonry. Late medieval designs integrated these features more seamlessly than ever before. Machicolations, those stone galleries projecting from the walls, became more common, allowing defenders to rain down destruction from a greater range of angles. Murder holes were no longer afterthoughts. They were meticulously positioned at the most vulnerable points along a staircase, such as tight turns or narrow landings, where an attacker was most off balance and exposed. Every innovation in siegecraft was met with a corresponding refinement in defensive psychology. The staircase stands as a perfect record of this centuries-long conversation. It is a physical timeline of military thought, showing us that our ancestors were not just building stronger walls. They were engaged in a dynamic, ever-evolving process of outthinking their opponents, using the very ground beneath their feet as their most cunning weapon. A shared language of defense was spoken across Europe, yet every region developed its own distinct accent. The universal principles of psychological warfare through architecture were brilliantly adapted to local stone, local threats, and local ways of life. Consider the formidable rectangular keeps of English castles like the Tower of London. Their sheer, massive walls were punctuated by spiral staircases tucked tightly into the corners of the structure. These stairs were not just defensive, they were almost hidden, reinforcing the keep's imposing, monolithic appearance and forcing any attacker into a confined, predictable ascent right against the building's strongest points. This was defense through overwhelming, centralized mass. A world away in the sun-scorched Levant, Crusader castles faced different challenges. The intense heat made enclosed, suffocating staircases a liability for the defenders living there year-round. Their ingenious solution was to use open-aired staircases or wide, vaulted passages. While these might seem more inviting, they were no less deadly. They still forced attackers into controlled, narrow channels that were easily watched and defended from the parapets above. The architecture adapted to the climate without sacrificing the core psychological tactic of restricting and monitoring movement. Then there are the stark and practical Scottish tower houses. Here, the psychological barrier began before you even set foot inside. The main entrance was often on the first floor, completely inaccessible from the ground. To enter, you had to be granted access via a removable ladder. This single feature created a powerful daily reminder of security. At a moment's notice, the Lord could withdraw the ladder and retreat into a self-contained fortress, leaving potential invaders staring up at an impassable stone wall. The very first step of an attack was made impossible without the defender's consent. This regional diversity proves a fascinating point. The mindset behind territorial defense was a universal constant. Builders from London to the Holy Land to the Scottish Highlands all understood the need to control approach, break momentum, and instill a sense of vulnerability. But the specific solutions were beautifully local, crafted from the materials and wisdom of the land. This was not a single blueprint copied across a continent. It was a deeply rooted, intelligent philosophy of safety, one that bloomed into 1,000 different forms, each perfectly suited to its own soil. The defender knew every inch of that stone coil by heart. For the castle guard, this architectural maze was not an obstacle but their personal training ground. They spent countless hours drilling on those exact steps, rehearsing maneuvers that would be instinctual in the chaos of a fight. A soldier practiced pivoting around the central newel post, using its solid mass as a shield to block incoming blows. He learned the precise spot on the outer curve where he could plant his feet for the most powerful downward swing. This intimate familiarity transformed a potential death trap into a position of absolute dominance. An attacker saw only danger and confusion in the tight spiral, but the defender saw a series of tactical opportunities he had rehearsed 100 times. This disparity in experience created a profound psychological chasm during an assault. The defender moved with a fluid, almost casual assurance, his actions precise and economical. The invader, by contrast, shuffled forward with hesitant, clumsy steps, his mind racing to process every new threat. the environment itself seemed to be cooperating with one side and actively sabotaging the other. This was the ultimate home field advantage engineered into the very stonework. It underscores a crucial point often overlooked. The castle's psychological defense was not a passive system that worked automatically. It was a weapon that required a skilled operator. A perfectly designed murder hole was useless without a defender who knew the best moment to drop the boiling pitch. A brilliantly disorienting staircase only achieved its full potential when patrolled by guards who could navigate its twists blindfolded. The garrison was not just living in a fortress. They were the human component of a single, integrated defensive machine. Their training turned the architect's cold calculations into a living, breathing system of territorial control. The staircase was a tool of immense power, but only in the hands of those who had mastered its every secret. Even the light was an enemy in these stone coils. The few narrow windows cut into the thick walls were not meant to illuminate the way. They were archery slits designed to let arrows out, not light in. This deliberate scarcity of illumination transformed the stairwell into a realm of deep, shifting shadows. An attacker would step from the relative brightness of a courtyard into a world of stark contrasts where his eyes struggled to adjust. Solid steps seemed to melt into dark voids. A shadow in an alcove could be a harmless recess, or it could be a waiting defender. This constant visual uncertainty forced the climber to hesitate with every footfall, turning a simple ascent into a nerve-wracking test of perception. The flickering dance of a torch or a single candle made the problem infinitely worse. Moving shadows would leap and writhe across the curved walls, creating the illusion of movement everywhere. Was that a man around the next bend, or just a trick of the light? This sensory deception preyed upon the brain's instinct to find patterns and threats in the unknown, keeping the invader in a state of high alert and exhausting his mental focus. For the castle's garrison, this engineered gloom was a second skin. They knew which shadow was permanent and which was cast by a passing guard. They could stand perfectly still in a dark niche and become invisible, waiting for the perfect moment to strike from the darkness. This manipulation of light and dark was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It weaponized the primal human fear of the unseen, turning the staircase into a liminal space between the known world and a terrifying void. Every step forward felt like a descent into a trap where the greatest threat was not what you could see, but what the darkness might be hiding just beyond your sight. The staggering cost of these staircases tells its own story. Constructing a perfect spiral with uneven steps and integrated murder holes required master stonemasons, not common laborers. It consumed vast quantities of expensive quarried stone. This was not a place to cut corners. For a medieval lord, investing such immense resources into a single internal feature was a profound declaration of priorities. He was stating, in the most permanent way possible, that the security of his final refuge was worth any price. This allocation of wealth reveals a deep-seated psychological understanding. These builders knew that a castle's greatest vulnerability was not always its outer wall, but the pathways inside it. An enemy who breached the gate would still have to face the gauntlet, and the Lord ensured that gauntlet was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. This thinking extended far beyond the heat of battle into the cold calculus of economics and reputation. A castle known for its deadly, impenetrable stairwell earned a fearsome legend. That reputation alone could deter an attack, saving the Lord the even greater cost of a prolonged siege. Why risk your army and treasury on a fortress whose heart was famously impossible to capture? The staircase became a strategic asset on parchment before it was ever tested in combat. It was a physical symbol of power and foresight, broadcasting a message to every rival and potential invader. The sheer expense of the stonework demonstrated immense wealth. The cleverness of its design showcased superior strategic intellect. Together, they created an aura of psychological dominance that was built to intimidate long before the first arrow was ever fired. This was more than architecture, it was a calculated investment in fear. The true victory was not measured in the bodies that fell, but in the assaults that never began. While the physical barriers of the staircase were formidable, their most devastating impact was invisible. A commander surveying the narrow, spiraling ascent, knowing his best soldiers would be reduced to a clumsy, single file, had to confront a chilling calculation. The cost of taking those steps might be the entire campaign. This is where defense transcended stone and mortar to become a weapon of pure psychology. The design aimed to implant a seed of inevitable failure in the mind of the enemy, cultivating a paralysis of will more effective than any wall. The sporadic clatter of a dropped shield echoing from within, the distant cry of a soldier caught in a murder hole, these sounds were not just noise. They were a carefully crafted narrative of despair broadcast to those waiting below. The staircase did not just kill attackers, it killed their resolve. It transformed courage into caution and aggression into apprehension. This represents one of history's earliest and most refined forms of psychological operation. The environment was not just a backdrop for battle. It was an active participant, a silent orator delivering a sermon on futility. The genius of this design lies in its holistic understanding of conflict. It recognized that a war is won not only by breaking bones, but by breaking spirit. The seamless blend of the tangible barrier with the intangible fear created a defensive system that was profoundly resilient. A system where the greatest strength was often the enemy's own imagination, turned against them by the cold, clever geometry of the steps. That deep-seated need to control movement through architecture never truly vanished. It simply evolved, trading stone for steel and glass. The same psychological principles that guided a medieval architect are now formalized in the design of our most secure modern spaces. Walk into any major bank or government building and you are immediately channeled. You do not choose your own path. You are funneled through a single, obvious access point, often under the unblinking gaze of a camera. This is the modern equivalent of the castle's narrow entrance staircase, a controlled choke point that forces everyone into a predictable and easily monitored stream. The goal is identical: to strip away the anonymity of a crowd and turn each person into an observable individual, just as the spiral staircase broke an army into isolated soldiers. Even the materials are chosen to influence feeling. The use of cold, hard surfaces like polished granite and stainless steel is not just for durability. These materials, much like the castle stone, are difficult to touch without leaving a mark, and they amplify sound, creating an environment that feels both imposing and easily monitored. You are meant to feel that your presence is noted and recorded, a subtle but powerful form of psychological deterrence. This is not a coincidence. It is the direct application of medieval territorial defense psychology, refined for an urban world. The maze is another tool that has been repurposed. Some subway stations or public plazas are intentionally designed with complex, winding pathways or uncomfortable, angled seating. This is not poor design. It is a strategic choice to prevent loitering and discourage crime by creating an environment that feels unsettled and difficult to control, a direct descendant of the castle's disorienting false corridors and dead ends. The principle remains to use confusion and discomfort as non-confrontational weapons for shaping behavior. This thinking has even permeated our virtual worlds. Video game-level designers are masters of this ancient craft. They lead you down narrow corridors not just to save on rendering power, but to control your pace and build anticipation. They place enemy snipers on high ledges, forcing you to look up and feel vulnerable, exactly as a defender would from a castle battlement. Environmental hazards like collapsing floors or patrolling enemies function like temporal murder holes, creating zones of anxiety that you must quickly navigate. These digital experiences trigger the same primal fears and strategic calculations that a medieval soldier felt on a stone staircase. The tension you feel in a well-designed game level is a testament to the enduring power of these psychological triggers. What was once an intuitive grasp of human behavior, etched into stone by castle builders, is now a formalized field of study known as environmental psychology. Science has confirmed what our ancestors knew in their bones, that the spaces we inhabit do not just house us. They actively shape our actions, our emotions, and our very sense of security. The medieval mind understood that to defend a territory, you must first design the mind of the intruder. Hollywood would have you believe a castle assault was a grand, sweeping battle across vast banquet halls. The truth was infinitely more terrifying, a slow, suffocating grind in the dark. Film directors favor spectacle over the grim, psychological reality of fighting in a space barely wider than your shoulders. You would not see heroic charges or dramatic sword fights in those twisting stone coils. You would see a desperate, clumsy shoving match, a brutal exercise in claustrophobia and confusion where the greatest enemy was often the wall pressing against your elbow. This romanticized view ignores the sheer, calculated genius of defensive design, trading historical accuracy for cinematic thrills. The real horror of staircase combat was not in dramatic clashes, but in the agonizing slowness, the inability to see, and the constant, gnawing fear that the next step might be your last. It was a form of warfare designed to break a soldier's spirit long before it broke his body. Correcting this fictionalized picture allows us to properly honor the medieval architects. They were not just building sets for action scenes. They were engineers of human despair, crafting environments that weaponized claustrophobia and vertigo. Their legacy is not in the grand, open halls of movies, but in the silent, cunning intelligence of a narrow stairwell that still stands centuries later. Medieval warfare was a profound duel between the engineer and the psychologist. On one side, the relentless innovation of siege technology produced monstrous trebuchets that could hurl boulders to shatter stone and sophisticated battering rams designed to splinter the strongest gates. These were tools of pure, overwhelming force, but the defenders answered with a different kind of genius, one that targeted not just the body, but the spirit of the attacker. They understood that a breach in the outer wall was not an end, but a transition to a new, more intimate phase of combat. This is where the holistic nature of their defense truly shone. The castle was not a single shell to be cracked. It was a layered system, and the failure of one layer merely funneled the enemy into the next, more psychologically punishing one. The staircase was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a final, deeply personal line of defense that acknowledged a hard truth. Walls can and will fall, but the human mind can be forged into a more resilient fortress if you know how to manipulate its fears and instincts. Every advancement in siegecraft, from the mining tunnel to the mobile siege tower, forced an equal and opposite innovation in defensive psychology. This arms race was not just fought on open fields. It was carved into the very blueprints of the fortress, etched into the curvature of every spiral and the uneven height of every single step. The staircase stands as the perfect symbol of this eternal struggle, a testament to the idea that the most powerful weapon is often an understanding of the enemy's own mind. Gunpowder did not make these psychological principles obsolete. It simply forced them to evolve. The thick, high walls of a medieval castle became fatally vulnerable to cannon fire, but the strategic mind behind those walls was far more resilient. Architects responded not by building taller, but by building smarter and wider, leading to the birth of the Star Fort in the Renaissance era. These fortifications replaced sheer height with complex, low-lying geometric shapes, all sharp angles and protruding bastions. The goal was no longer to stop an army at the gate, but to lure it into a series of calculated traps. The long, straight approaches of a medieval barbican were replaced by intricate networks of ditches and ramps that channeled attackers directly into the crossfire of multiple cannons. This was the medieval funneling principle scaled up to a terrifying new level, creating vast, open-air killing zones where every step forward was exposed from multiple, unseen angles. The geometry itself was designed to disorient and trap, proving that the weaponization of space had moved far beyond the staircase. This thinking persisted for centuries, right into the industrial horrors of the World Wars. The trench systems of the First World War were essentially sprawling, subterranean castles. They were mazes of narrow, zigzagging passages, deliberately designed with sharp turns to contain the blast of a shell and to prevent an enemy who breached one section from having a clear line of fire down the entire length of the trench. These were choke points on a massive scale, forcing infantry into the same kind of confined, close-quarters combat that defined a spiral staircase assault. Bunker complexes from Normandy to the Pacific used the same core concepts, with reinforced corridors built to be defended by a single machine gunner, turning a modern, technological war back into a brutal series of one-on-one duels in the dark. The fundamental idea has never faded from military doctrine. Whether carved from stone, packed earth, or poured concrete, the principle remains. A defender's greatest ally is a controlled environment that breaks an attacker's will, turning their advance into a slow, stressful, and predictable procession toward a predetermined end. The medieval staircase was the foundational classroom for this brutal science, a lesson in how empty space, when properly shaped, becomes an instrument of absolute control. The stones themselves bear the scars of these ancient duels. Modern archaeology has turned these silent witnesses into compelling storytellers, offering physical proof that these psychological strategies were not just theoretical, but meticulously practiced. Look closely at the worn steps of a ruined spiral staircase. You will often find the most pronounced erosion on the outer, curved edge, the very spot where a defender would have stood to wield his weapon with full force. This is not random weathering. It is the ghostly imprint of countless practiced stances, a permanent record of where guards positioned themselves for the perfect killing blow. This pattern of wear confirms what the historical documents suggest, that defenders trained relentlessly in these spaces, turning the architecture into an extension of their own bodies. Even the chilling precision of a murder hole is now measurable. Archaeologists can map their locations with laser accuracy, finding they are almost always positioned at the most vulnerable points on a staircase, like tight turns or narrow landings, where an attacker would be most off balance and exposed. This careful placement was a deliberate calculation, not a haphazard afterthought. The same scientific analysis applies to the uneven steps. By measuring the treads, researchers can confirm that the variations in height and depth are too consistent to be simple construction errors. They form a repeating, disruptive pattern designed to break an attacker's rhythm. This physical evidence allows us to reverse engineer the defensive logic of the builders, moving from speculation to fact. We are not just interpreting old texts. We are reading a blueprint for psychological warfare that was carved directly into the stone. The ruins tell us that this was a real, implemented doctrine, a brutal and effective science where every chip in the stone was a testament to its success. That ingenuity forces us to confront a deeply unsettling moral question. We can admire the brilliant engineering, the clever application of human psychology, but we must also acknowledge the chilling truth. These designs were not abstract puzzles. They were meticulously crafted instruments of death and terror, their sole purpose to inflict maximum psychological and physical harm on other people. This was a cold, clinical application of science for destructive ends, turning the fundamental human need for shelter into a factory for despair. Every uneven step was a deliberate act of cruelty. Every murder hole was a premeditated plan for agony. The entire system was a monument to the idea that the most effective way to defeat an enemy was to first systematically dismantle their mind, to weaponize their own fears against them. This history compels us to look at our own world with a more critical eye. We still use architecture to control and influence behavior, but to what end? Consider the modern prison, where layouts are designed for constant surveillance and to minimize human contact, or the urban planning decisions that use concrete barriers and uncomfortable, angled benches to deter the homeless from settling in public spaces. Our cities are filled with subtle and not so subtle features that manipulate movement and dictate where people are and are not welcome. The medieval staircase is a stark lesson in the immense power of environmental design. It teaches us that this power is neutral, a tool that can be used to create spaces of safety and community, or to build structures of control and oppression. Understanding this dark potential is not about condemning the past, but about accepting a profound responsibility for the present. When we design any space, we are not just arranging bricks and mortar. We are actively shaping human experience, and with that power comes the essential duty to ask ourselves, for whose benefit and at whose cost are we building? Those winding staircases are frozen lessons in territorial defense psychology, carved in stone for us to decipher. They were not random constructions. Every clockwise spiral was a deliberate act of disarming a right-handed soldier. Every uneven step was a calculated effort to break an attacker's rhythm and focus. Each narrow passage was designed to shatter the unity of an army, turning a coordinated force into a line of isolated, frightened individuals. These features reveal a profound, almost intuitive grasp of human nature. The medieval architect understood our deepest fears, the limitations of our own bodies under stress, and how to weaponize the environment itself to create a sense of inescapable vulnerability. This was not just building, it was a form of psychological warfare, a brutal science of the mind, and its legacy is all around us. The controlled access points in a modern bank, the disorienting pathways in a subway station, the strategic choke points in a video game level. All of these are descendants of that medieval mindset. They all use designed space to influence our behavior, to control our movement, and to shape our emotional state. So the next time you walk through an imposing building or even climb a simple set of steps, pause for a moment. Consider the hidden psychology in every turn and every tread. Ask yourself what the space is trying to make you feel and what its design reveals about the mind of its creator. If this journey into the mind of the medieval architect has sparked your curiosity, please subscribe for more explorations into history's hidden secrets. We would love to hear your thoughts on these ancient psychological strategies in the comments below.